The German political system is a natural choice to discuss in a session on electoral systems because the German electoral system combines the two systems out there in an interesting way. Let's look at that political system, starting with the voters. They do two things. They elect the parliament directly, one chamber of the parliament directly. That's the Bundestag, so that's this left arrow here, which has about 600 members. The exact number varies in some sort of complex and unpredictable ways, but it's about 600. Those elections happen every 4 years normally, and only parties enter the parliament if they receive at least 5% of the vote share, or if they receive 3 direct mandates, and that will be explained a little later. The second thing that voters do is they elect state parliaments, and then state parliaments form state governments, and state governments pack or choose members of the other chamber of the parliament, the Bundesrat. And that parliament has, or that chamber of parliament has 69 members. However, these aren't the same people. These vary by domain. Depending on what the issue is at hand, there will be different people. So basically, every state has a number of votes. That's how it works. Now, the two chambers never assemble jointly, with one exception, and that is when they get together every 5 years to elect a president. So even though the German system is a parliamentary system, there is a president, and that president gets elected by both chambers. The Bundesrat gets also the same number of members as the Bundestag has for that one purpose, and then there is an election for the president. Now, the president is not a particularly important figure in this system for reasons that have a lot to do with German history and the experience in the Weimar Republic between 1919 and 1933, which is when Hitler became Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, or of Germany. And in the Weimar Republic, the role of the president was incredibly strong. And the president was directly elected, and the president has had sweeping powers. And the last president also happened to be not particularly supportive of democracy, and so that was a bad combination of factors. And it was a very conscious choice to make the president in the post-Nazi and post-World War II era a weaker figure. Now, the most important person, politically speaking, in this political system is the chancellor. And the chancellor, as in parliamentary systems typically, is elected by the parliament. So when the Bundestag gets together after the election, they somehow need to figure out a majority to elect a chancellor. That's what they will do first. And then that chancellor appoints a cabinet, and that's the government, that's the executive. There's also a constitutional court, which is very, very strong. It's modeled after the American Supreme Court. It's differently structured. It has more members. Members aren't appointed for life, but for very long terms. And it's less politically charged compared to the Supreme Court, and it's differently elected, or the judges are differently elected. So essentially, half of the judges are chosen by the Bundesrat and half of them are chosen by the Bundestag legally, but practically each party owns seats. So if one of the judges retires or the term is over, then the norm is that the same party gets to pick their candidate, and given that they need large majorities to confirm these judges, they tend to be fairly middle of the road. Until recently, the president of Germany was Joachim Gauck, who is an East German. His term was 5 years, so he only had one term from 2012 to 2017, and the chancellor is Angela Merkel. Since 2017, the president is Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who is from the Social Democratic Party. Let's have a closer look at the lower chamber, the Bundestag, the directly elected chamber of parliament. Simply put, half of the members of parliament are elected in a first-past-the-post electoral system, and the other half is elected with a proportional representation system. The former, the first-past-the-post electoral system, we call the Erststimme, the first vote in this electoral system, and the latter, the proportional representation part, we call it Zweitstimme, or the second vote in this system. This all sounds very abstract. Let me make it more precise. This is an actual ballot from an election in 2009. And you see here on the left in black the first vote that people have, and you see on the right the second vote that they have. And on the left you vote for a person, and only one person will win a seat. So all of these candidates here that are listed, the candidates, the first candidate here from the SPD, the second candidate from the CDU, but they don't have to be associated with parties, these candidates, they just typically are. And only one of these candidates will win a seat. So whoever gets the most votes in this district will win that seat. And you are very familiar with this principle because this is how you elect, for example, senators or members of Congress, members of the House. There will be typically in the US a candidate from the Republicans and a candidate from the Democrats. You vote, and whoever gets most votes gets that one senator seat or that one seat in the House. Now, on the right side of this ballot is a different type of electoral system. And here you're not electing a person, here you're electing a party. And that party proposes a list of candidates. So we're not in this right part of the ballot trying to fill a single seat, but we're trying to fill a bunch of seats, let's just say 10 seats. And what we do is we will count the number of votes for each of the parties, which will give us a share of the votes for each parties, and then we will give each party the percentage of seats that corresponds roughly to the percentage of the votes that they got. For example, if the SPD here wins 25% of the votes, the SPD will get about 25% of those 10 seats, which would be 4 seats. If the CDU wins 50% of the vote share, then it will get 50% of the seats, which would be, in our example where there's 10 seats, would be 5 seats, and so on and so forth. There is, however, one condition, which is parties only will gain seats if they get at least 5% of the vote share, which is something we call an electoral threshold or an electoral hurdle. And in comparison to other countries, that is a fairly large number, 5%. So many countries have these hurdles or thresholds, but they're typically lower. It is, in the German case, so high, again, for historical reasons, because the Weimar Republic, the democracy between 1919 and 1933 that ended with the Nazi regime, in that democracy, the electoral threshold was extremely low. It was 60,000 votes, and you were in, which is less than 1%, or it's about effectively a 1% threshold. And what that meant was that you had a lot of small parties represented with like 1 or 2 seats in that parliament, which made it rather difficult to form stable coalitions, and that was one of the reasons why the Weimar Republic was so unstable. So let's zoom in here on the left side of that ballot. If you zoom in on the left side of the ballot, you see a name. They also give you an address of the person. They give you the job of the person, and they tend to give you the party. So many people will simply vote for the candidate that is their party. However, there will be strategic voting. So the big parties in Germany are on the left the SPD and on the right the CDU. At least historically that's the case. That's somewhat changing. A party that's always been around but never has been particularly large is the FDP, the Liberal Party, here the number 4. And so if your preference is to have a coalition between the CDU and the FDP, which is a very common preference in the in German history and in the German electorate, then you are typically electing with your first vote, with your Erststimme. So on this ballot, you wouldn't vote for the FDP candidate, but for the CDU candidate, because everybody knows this is going to come down to a choice between the biggest 2 parties. So either the SPD candidate will win or the CDU candidate will win. And so voting for your true choice, which would be the FDP candidate, is in many ways a waste of your vote, because that person has absolutely no chance to win that seat. And therefore, if you want to maximize your preferences, you would be better off switching your vote to your second best choice, which would be likely the CDU, which actually has a chance of winning that seat. Now on the right side, what you see here is a bunch of names on the under the party label. So here, for example, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 names. Note also that some candidates are both on the left side and on the right side. In this particular case, it is Katharina Feike. In the CDU, you see the same thing here on the left and on the right. You also see that Dr. Angela Merkel is the first position on that list. So the party proposes a slate of candidates for all of the seats on that list. So if you're electing 10 seats with the right ballot, then the CDU as well as the SPD will put forward 10 candidates that are ordered. And the first candidate gets to go first, and then if the CDU wins 3 seats, let's say, then it would send Angela Merkel, Eckhard Rehberg, and Matthias Litz into the parliament, into the Bundestag. And the other ones wouldn't make it. So the order of that list is very important and will determine essentially who gets in. So if you're at number 10 on that list, you're almost certain to not make it. You can also see that this can lead to some weird situations where someone gets elected through the right side. Here, Matthias Litz could win a seat through the proportional system, and Matthias Litz could also win a seat through the direct vote, through the Erststimme, through the first vote. And that's why the size of the parliament is varies from election to election, because there's a complicated balancing mechanism to make sure that the overall representation is proportional to the second vote. It's a complicated mechanism. It's also one that's routinely debated at the German Supreme Court, so it's likely unconstitutional every now and then, and so it's sort of a complex system. So the broader significance of elections, or as well as referenda, is that they're really the two main opportunities for citizens to participate in politics. And in many countries, especially in many Western European countries, referenda are actually very uncommon. The only country where referenda at the national level are normal and frequent and part of the daily political process almost is Switzerland. In most other modern democracies, we have the occasional referenda at the national level, or in some cases they don't exist at all. It's different at the subnational level. If you think about the US, there's a lot of referenda at the state level, for example, in California, but not at the national level. In Germany, for example, once again, for historical reasons, there are no national referenda. They were used to bad or ill effect during the Weimar Republic, that failed democracy that existed from 1919 to 1933. And they became huge propaganda machines and had a very detrimental effect on the health of the democracy. And so elections really are the number one way in which citizens participate in politics, and they're held, these elections, to fill seats that are occupied by people that represent us, our representatives. And typically these representatives are sent into the parliament in Western Europe, because we're talking about parliamentary systems. Now, the difference between elections and referendums is a referendum is a vote on a specific issue that a majority wants to approve or reject. For example, in the UK, there was a referendum in 2016 asking, do you want the United Kingdom to exit the European Union? And people voted in majority yes, and that triggered the Brexit. There are other famous referenda. There was one shortly before that, again in the UK, asking Scots whether they want to be independent from the United Kingdom, and that did not go through. There are referenda. In France, there was a referendum to change the duration of the tenure of the president from 7 to 5 years. And so there is sort of extraordinary issues, very specific issues that get a thumbs down or a thumbs up in a referendum. Elections are different because they're used to fill seats. And we set up elections because we can't do this Athenian-style democracy where we have everybody participating directly in decision making. And therefore we elect representatives that represent our interests, supposedly. And therefore, in many ways, these representatives are our link into governments. And voters' best shot at participating in government is to elect people and hold them accountable by then not re-electing them if they're not behaving. Most countries in Western Europe are parliamentary democracies where voters elect a parliament and then the parliament elects the executive branch, just like in the German system where voters elect the Bundestag and the Bundestag elects the chancellor. What electoral systems do is, that's basically this era, and they somehow translate votes into seats, and they do this in very different ways. Electoral system sounds like a pretty dry institution to talk about. However, they really are tremendously important, and I think pretty exciting actually. So in terms of definition, it's the set of rules that governs the conversion of votes into seats. And in terms of importance, they are hugely important. They influence a country's party system first and foremost, and that in turn influences the way in which governments are formed and that then influences how people's preferences and interests are represented. There is a wide other range of influence of electoral systems, of direct influence on policy and indirect influence on policy. For example, one famous relationship that we know of is that electoral systems that are first past the post, such as in the American system, or majoritarian electoral systems as they're called more generally, they tend to go hand in hand with lower social spending, while proportional representational systems tend to go hand in hand with larger welfare states. And there's a lot of theories out there why this might be the case. Now, electoral systems can be categorized along several dimensions. The dimensions of electoral systems are, first, the formula, the district magnitude, the intra-party choice, the electoral thresholds, and the degree of disproportionality. I will concentrate pretty squarely on the first and the fourth. Just to cover the other aspects real quick, district magnitude refers to the size of the number of seats that are up for grabs in an election, and that can be anywhere from one, as in one senator seat, to many. In the extreme case, the whole parliament. So in the Netherlands, every Dutch citizen in an election gets the same list, and it's something like 200 or 300 members of parliament will be elected in that one ballot. In other systems, in other countries, it's somewhere in between, where not the entire parliament is elected by everybody, but it's regionalized lists. So in the German case, for example, the list in Bavaria, which is a state, looks different from the list in Baden-Württemberg or any other state. So that's the distinction between single-member constituencies and multi-member constituencies. In terms of intra-party choice, in some systems you do not have any choice over the list. In particular, in single-member constituencies where there's only one seat to be filled, you basically choose either any of the candidates, but you don't have any choice beyond that. In PR systems, it's different in different countries. In some countries, the list that you're presented with, so number 1, number 2, number 3, is fixed, and you just make one cross, and then the members of parliament get sent to the parliament depending on the order in which they're sitting on that list. In other systems, you can actually pick and choose, and you have a preferential list system where you can say, oh, I like the 7th candidate on the list, and he gets, I want him to be have a higher probability of getting elected. So, but these are fairly rare at the national level. Sweden, in fact, is the only case I can think of on top of my head. The other dimensions that I want to quickly mention are electoral thresholds. I'll come back to that. And then the degree of disproportionality. Basically, the translation of votes into seats happens in different ways in different electoral systems. And in some systems, it will take a lot of there will be a lot of inequality between the percentage of the voter party got and the percentage of the seats they got. The most extreme examples are first past the post system, where you can win a seat with only a majority of the vote, meaning that everybody that's not first will not be represented. In other cases, the percentage of the vote that a party wins and the percentage of the seats that they get is actually pretty close. Here's an example of a ballot in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the parliament has 150 seats, which are elected in one nationwide election with one list. So every Dutch citizen sees the same ballot. And that ballot has a number of parties on it, many parties, and each party proposes a slate of candidates as a list, as an ordered list. As you can see here, This first party here, this is the first person on the list, this is the second person on the list, and so on and so forth. And you have one vote, and you typically would, as a Dutch voter, give that vote to the top candidate of the party that you would like to see represented in parliament. But if for whatever reason you like a different candidate better further down the list or from another party, you can cross that person. So you have one vote and you can give it to any candidate on that list. And then representation in parliament is assigned by the proportion of the vote share that a party gets from the overall electorate. And if a person further down the list gets a lot of votes because for whatever reason people like that person better down the list, then they will move up the list. With respect to electoral formulas, we would distinguish two broad types of formulas. And you've seen them because in Germany they used both for the election of the parliament. On the one hand, you have the one that is familiar to Americans and British voters, and that's the plurality and majority formulas, which are also called the first past the post formulas. So in the plurality formula, simply whoever gets the most votes gets the seat. So these are single district seats. There's one seat, one senator that will get the job, and the candidate with the most votes will get the seats. There is a slightly different version of this, which is a majority plurality version, where you essentially have two rounds of elections. You have a first round where you have a lot of candidates, and then you will have a second round of elections where you will take the typically top two vote getters or something like this, and they will have a runoff election in the second round. This is something that happens in the French presidential election. It also happens for the French parliament in a different way. The second type of electoral formula are proportional representation formulas, where you have a list system, as you've seen in the, say, Netherlands or in Sweden, and then you have mixed systems that combine a list system and such as the proportional representation system with the second vote in Germany, with a different type of formula, which is the first vote in Germany, which is a plurality formula. So an example of the single-member plurality first past the post system would be in Western Europe, the UK. The candidate with the most votes is elected, and the same thing, of course, is true in the United States. An example of the two-round system or a plurality majority system is France, where if no candidates reaches the majority in the first round, the least successful candidates are eliminated and the second round takes place. So here the French system, the presidential election, which happens every 5 years, happens in two rounds. In the 2017 presidential election in France, in the first round, Emmanuel Macron won about 24% of the vote. Marine Le Pen from the radical right-wing Front National won 22%, and the other candidates won 19 and some percent, and so it goes down the list. Since nobody received a majority of the vote, so nobody received 50% or more of the vote, there was a second round 2 weeks later on May 7, with the two top vote getters, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, facing off. The result in the second round was pretty straightforward. Macron won an overwhelming majority with 2/3 of all votes cast, versus Le Pen's 33%. Examples of proportional representation formulas are list systems, such as in Sweden, where the party presents a list of candidates, and you can, typically you choose a party. You can, in some countries such as Sweden, you can have some impact on the order of the candidates. In many cases, you cannot. You simply vote for one party and you accept the list of candidates in that order in which the party has proposed them. And as mentioned, the mixed systems where voters have two different types of votes, one for a candidate and one for a list, and Germany is the prime example. That surely not the only country that does this kind of type of voting. Japan and Italy would be other examples. To make sure that not two small parties are represented in parliament, many countries implement thresholds, which are hurdles for parties that they have to jump in order to get represented. So you want to assign seats only to parties that have X% of the overall vote share, and otherwise they just don't get representation. And the idea is to prevent very small parties from winning seats, to prevent fragmentation of the party system, and to facilitate stable governments. At least that's the reasons that larger parties would nominate. Smaller parties would say, oh, you're just trying to keep us out of parliament. These thresholds or hurdles vary across countries, but they're normally anywhere between 3 and 5%, but sometimes significantly lower. So in the Netherlands, it would be a tiny 0.6, so less than 1%. In Sweden, it would be 4%, and in Germany, it would be 5%. There is a wrinkle in the German case because of this two-vote system. You actually have two ways as a party to be represented in parliament. Either you make it through the list and you make that 5% threshold, or if you don't, you still can gain seats in the direct votes, in the first votes. And if you get 3 of those seats, then you get represented with the vote share that you gained in the list, no matter what the threshold was. It's worth considering Duverger's law, or reconsidering it. Duverger's law is basically the answer to the question, what determines the number of parties in parliament in general, and in particular, why do you have two-party systems versus multi-party systems? And Duverger's law observes that if you have majoritarian electoral systems, such as in the UK or in the US, you tend to end up with two-party systems. And as a sort of derivation of this law, you can say if you have proportional representation or PR systems, then you will end up with multi-party systems. The mechanisms behind this law are twofold. You have a mechanical effect where high thresholds prevent simply make it they keep out smaller parties, and you have a psychological effect both on the demand and the supply side. On the demand side, voters have strategic reasons to vote, or they vote strategically. So a voter in a first-past-the-post system who selects a small party candidate knows that that small party candidate has no chance of being represented. Think about a presidential election in the United States. You have typically a choice between a candidate from the Democrats and a candidate from the Republicans, and you know it's going to be either the Democratic or the Republican candidate. So why would you give your vote to, say, a third-party candidate or a Green Party candidate or a Libertarian candidate if you know that they're not going to become president? So some people would say that you just wasted your vote, although there's a different school of thought which suggests that you're doing this for some other reasons. And we don't have to get into this, but into this argument, but as a matter of fact, many people feel compelled to vote strategically. So even if they would like, say, the Green Party candidate better, they vote typically then for the Democratic candidate because it's their second best choice, and they know that the Democratic Party candidate actually, or the Democratic presidential candidate actually has a better shot at winning the presidency. Now, on the supply side, the mirror image applies because you have incentives for parties to merge. So a third-party candidate should not really run because they know it's going to be pretty pointless, at least in terms of the probability of winning office. Before we move on with a few examples, let me clarify language here. Majority means 50% and a little bit, or more than half of the votes. So that would also be an absolute majority. A plurality is the most votes, so which you can also describe as a relative majority. As a little exercise, I put together a list of hypothetical election results here on the right, where you have a bunch of candidates or parties from A to E, and the vote share that they gained. Conveniently, it sums up to 100%. So the first party got 40% of the votes, the second party 30%, and so on and so forth. So as a first question, which party has a majority? Given what we talked about a second ago, none has, because a majority would mean at least 51% or 51 seats, or more than 50% of the vote share, which none of the parties has. Which party has a plurality? Recall that plurality simply means vote winner here, or most votes. In this case, that is A. Now, what would happen if this were the result of a British district election? And for this answer, you need to know how British elections work, and we've seen that they have first past the post systems, which means that in this case, the party with the most votes wins that one single seat that's up for grabs in the election, which in this case would be A. What would happen if this was a French presidential election result in the first round? What would happen is, given that none of them has a majority, none of these candidates, A to E, has a majority, you would eliminate all but the top two vote getters and have a second round. So there would be a runoff election between A and B, the top two vote getters in the first round. If this was an American presidential election, well, it would be a little more complex because there is the Electoral College, but by and large, the way the president is elected in the United States is that whoever wins the majority is president. But again, there's the Electoral College making this statement only half correct. If this was an election for the German Bundestag, well, this is a tricky question, because you would need to know whether this is the result from the first vote or from the second vote. So if this was the first the left part of the ballot, or the first vote, where candidates are directly elected and first past the post, then candidate A would have won that seat. If this was a second vote, where voters in a PR type election select a list, then Party A would have won 40% of the seats, B would have won 30% of the seats, and so on and so forth. So what would happen is that the parties A, B, C, and D get represented. E would not get represented, because if you recall, in Germany, if you don't have at least 5% of the vote, overall you're not going to be represented in parliament. To make things a little more interesting, if this was an election for the German Bundestag, and now I give you additional information, namely that Party E had won 3 direct seats in the first vote, you know that that would basically cancel out the threshold, or get rid of the threshold, so that that party would get represented in parliament no matter the percentage of the overall vote share that they got. So even if they get less than 5%, in this scenario where they have won 3 direct seats, they will be represented. So the answer to this question is that all of the parties would get represented. A, B, C, D, and E will be represented. And finally, if this is an election for the Swedish Riksdag, which is the Swedish parliament, which parties would be represented? To answer this question, you need to know the electoral threshold, or the hurdle, in the Swedish system, which, as discussed, is 4%. So the answer is that A, B, C, D, and E would be represented. Electoral systems tell us how voters' choices get translated into seats in terms of vote shares that party receive in an election and the number of seats that they get in a parliament, in fused power systems or parliamentary systems, but also in separation of power systems. The next question is, if you have a number of parties sitting in parliament and none of them has a majority, which parties will form a coalition in order to build a government, which is something that we need in fused power systems or parliamentary systems. Most Western European countries are parliamentary systems, so what happens is that you have voters electing a parliament, and then the parliament elects an executive branch. If you think about the British system, voters select the House of Commons selects the Prime Minister. And the question is, how is this done? Which parties will form a majority in order to select a government? This brings us to coalition theory. What you see here is a hypothetical parliament which has 5 parties, Party A, B, C, D, and E. Party A is the leftmost, Party E is the most rightward party, Party C is somewhere in the middle. there are 100 seats, and party A has 8 seats, B has 21, and so on and so forth, as you can see from this table. In order to form a government, a majority government, you will need a majority of the seats to select a prime minister or a chancellor. So you need at least 50% plus 1 seat, which in this case would be 51 seats because there are 100 seats. Now, if you look at this hypothetical parliament, which parties do you think will get together in order to form a government? So I want you to look at these numbers and think about this question a little bit. Well, this question of which parties will together to form a majority or even supermajority to elect an executive turns out to be the subject of a vibrant literature on coalition theory. And in Leipert's book, chapter 6, we are exposed to 6 different types of proposals here, or different coalition theories. The minimal winning coalitions proposal, the minimum size, bargaining proposition, minimal range, minimal connected winning, and policy viable coalitions. I will now go over each of those and give you some examples. The minimal winning coalition is a coalition of parties that is such that if you remove one party from that coalition, the majority is gone. If you look at this hypothetical parliament again, which is the same as I put up a couple slides ago, the minimal winning coalitions are, for example, A, B, and C. If you take A and B together, they have 29 seats. 8 plus 21 seats is 29 seats, which is less than the required 51% or 51 seats that they would need for a majority. If you add party C to this coalition, so that you have A, B, and C, then you end up with 8 plus 21, which is 29, and then you add 26 seats to this, so you have 55 seats, which is a majority. So A, B, and C is a majority, and if you remove any of those parties, then the majority would be gone, which means we have found a minimal winning coalition. There is a prominent theory out there that says that coalition governments will be formed by minimal winning coalitions. The problem is there's often many of them. In this hypothetical example alone, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different minimal winning coalitions, which are listed here in this row. So ABC, as we talked about, is as much a minimal winning coalition as is, for example, C plus E. C and E have together more than 51 seats, or more than 50 seats. So another natural proposal would then be to say it's going to be the smallest of those minimal winning coalitions. The minimum size coalition is the minimal winning coalition that is the narrowest possible of all of the minimal winning coalitions in terms of the majority. So it's the narrowest possible majority, which if you go through all of the examples, A, B, and C, A, D, and E, B, C, D, and B, E, and C, E, you simply take the one that takes the fewest seats. For example, if you look at C and E, they have together 59 seats. But if you look at A, D, and E, they have together 53 seats. And if you look at all of these minimal winning coalitions, you will find that A, D, and E are the smallest seats combined. A, D, and E have 53 seats. A third type of coalition or predicted coalition that would form says it's ought to be the smallest number of parties. So if you look at the minimal winning coalitions again, then you'll see that some of them have 3 parties and others have 2 parties. And some scholars have argued that, well, it's going to be more likely that a coalition forms if there's fewer parties, even if it's not the minimum size coalition. So we already know that the minimum size coalition is A, D, and E, which happens to be 3 parties. So the minimum size coalitions in this particular example are the 2 minimal winning coalitions that have only 2 parties, which are BE and CE. Which of these do you think is more plausible in terms of actually forming Well, there's you could make arguments in all sorts of directions. So, for example, B and E together have 54 seats. C and E together have 59 seats. So B and E is smaller, which would argue that B and E is more likely. On the other hand, B and E are ideologically further apart than C and E, so that would speak in favor of C and E. As you can see, this isn't an exact science. If we consider ideology as another factor, so if we actually know that A is left and E is right and the other parties are in the middle, some people have argued that the coalitions that are most likely to form are those that are ideologically coherent, meaning that the parties that are members of that coalition span a relatively small ideological space. Once again, if you look at the minimal winning coalitions, you'll find examples of coalitions that span the entire ideological space. Again, A, D, and E, for example, includes both the most left-wing and the most right-wing party, and as such, many people would argue is not a very likely coalition, even though it's the minimum size coalition. And if you look at the coalitions, the set of party coalitions from the minimal winning coalitions that are minimal range, the answer will be A, B, and C spans 3 parties next to each other, B, C, D spans 3 parties next to each other, and C, E spans 3 parties, though party D is not included. Some scholars have argued you cannot really exclude a party between 2 parties ideologically speaking, so that you do need the minimal range as before, A, B, C, B, C, D, and these people would argue that C, E is not a coalition that would form. It's more likely that C, D, and E would form a coalition because D cannot be excluded. Technically it can be excluded, but normatively, I guess people would argue. And as you can see, that a minimal connected winning coalition is not necessarily a minimal winning coalition, right? C, D, and E has an extra party that is not necessary, so I could remove party D from here, and I would still have a majority, which means it's not a minimal winning coalition. And finally, some scholars predict that basically the middle party is going to be in the coalition no matter what. So the middle party, if you have 5 parties, is the party that has 2 parties to the left and 2 parties to the right of it, which in our little toy example is C. So that theory would predict that the minimal winning coalitions need to include C in order to be likely actual coalitions in politics, which are coalitions A, B, C, B, C, D, and C and E. Here is an overview of the types of coalitions that scholars distinguish. And there are debates about which of these are most likely to actually happen in Western Europe. To make this more realistic, you can see the distribution of seats across the 5 major parties in the German parliaments since 2002. There are 5 major parties, 5 main parties that made it into parliament. They are sorted arguably from the very left to the very right. The first thing to note is that the number of seats is not constant, which is a little strange. So the parliament is sometimes 306 seats in 2002, and later in 2013 it's 631 seats. This has to do with the need to balance the results from the first vote and the second vote. It's a fairly complicated process. That also means that the number of seats required for a majority varies slightly. So in the year 2002, you need 302 seats at least to have a majority, and in 2013 that number is higher. What I want you to do is take a moment and find at least 2 minimal winning coalitions in 2002, find the minimal connected winning coalitions, and then wonder what the actual coalitions were. I'll help you a little bit. So in terms of 2002, if the easiest way to find a minimal winning coalition is simply to take the 2 biggest parties and to combine them, because none of them has a majority itself, so none of the big parties anywhere here on the entire slide has more than a majority. So if you just combine the two biggest parties, they will have a majority. They have almost 500 seats in this example, way above the 300 required. And you couldn't take one of these away without losing the majority. So that is the definition of a minimal winning coalition. So that's the lazy way to find one. It's also, according to how I sorted parties, a minimal connected winning coalition because they're sitting next to each other. What was the actual coalition? Well, the actual coalition was a red-green coalition between the Green Party and the Social Democratic Party. Together they had 306 seats, which is just about the majority seats that they needed, so they were able to elect a chancellor together. In the 2005 election, however, if you count the Green and SPD seats, you will find that they have 273 seats, which is less than the 308 seats that you would need for a majority. So they lost the majority. They lost the election pretty clearly. It turns out most main parties lost in that election. The big winners were the PDS and the FDP, the Liberal Party. The PDS Left Party is this party that comes historically from the Communist Party in East Germany, but has morphed into a new left party. So the Green and SPD party lost a majority. Now, if you need to find more minimal winning coalitions, you can again do that simple trick and add the two biggest parties together, which still obviously have a majority. So that is a minimal winning coalition. And it turns out it is actually the coalition that formed. So in 2005, the coalition was one between the Social Democrats and the CDU, or the Christian Democrats. We call this a grand coalition. If the big party of the left and the big party of the right get together, we're talking about a grand coalition. Now, interestingly, there is a bunch of other minimal winning coalitions in this scenario, but most of them require three parties. In fact, all of them require green parties. So in the 2005 election, the only minimal winning coalition that you will find that has only two parties is the Grand Coalition. We have called this the bargaining proposition. In 2009, the situation again changes with the SPD losing dramatic vote shares, so being substantively weakened in that election, and the FDP winning a large amount of seats. And so if you now do the math, you will find that the CDU and the Liberal Party here have together more than the required 312 seats, and that is actually the coalition that formed. In 2013, the situation once again changed, and the Liberal Party, which was in government, lost so badly that they didn't even make the 5% threshold or hurdle and did not make it into parliament, so that changed the dynamics quite a bit. So in 2013, there's only 4 parties in parliament, with the CDU being clearly the biggest one, but it's not obvious that the CDU would end up in government, because if you think about a coalition between the PDS, the Green Party, and the SPD, they actually have more than 316 seats together. They actually all left parties. So many observers thought that it would be attractive for the SPD, rather than being the junior partner in the coalition with the CDU, that they would be the senior partner of a 3-party coalition. And typically that would mean they would have the chancellorship and the most influence in that coalition. This is not what happened. Instead, we once again got a grand coalition between the SPD and the CDU, which together have way more than the 316 seats. In fact, it is 504 seats that they have. Now, why wasn't it the case that the 3 left parties got together and formed a government? Well, politics is personal to some degree, and the left party here is a split off from the SPD, and so there was a lot of bad blood between those 2 parties. And before the election, the Social Democrats announced very publicly that they would not form a coalition with the Linke or the Left Party under any circumstances. How common are coalition governments in Western Europe? The answer is very common in most countries. If you look at the set of countries here in this table, you will find that with a few exceptions, coalitions are the norm. So how to read this table? You should read it the following way. These are government forms and cabinet duration from 1945 to 2007, so fairly recent data. And if you look at Austria, for example, Austria had 6 single-party coalitions in that time frame. It had 19 coalition governments in that time frame, which means that 76% of all Austrian coalitions between 1945 and 2007 were coalition governments. And if you go down that list, you see that that percentage of coalition governments on overall governments is fairly high and typically over 50% with a few exceptions. Luxembourg is an exception. It's actually 100%. Netherlands is 100%. The exceptions here are Spain and the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom after 2007 actually had a coalition, so that would not be 0% today anymore. But you see that there are more coalition governments on average. 2/3 of all governments in European countries are coalition governments. So it's the normal way in which governments are formed. If you look at their stability in terms of the duration of governments, the pattern isn't super obvious. So if you look in Austria, the single-party governments were much more stable in the sense that they were the duration in government was longer than the duration of coalition governments. Coalition governments can break up, which leads to new elections typically, or at least a new government. But the pattern isn't so clear in all countries. If you look at Germany, for example, the single-party duration is very short and the coalition duration is much longer. So the patterns aren't nearly as obvious as one would have expected. Another question one might ask is, did these coalitions always have majorities? Which you might think is a strange question, because how can you elect a government without having a majority? What is a minority government even? But it is possible, totally possible, to elect a government with a formal coalition that has less than 50% of the votes if you borrow votes from other parties for electing the prime minister, and that can happen. And you have caretaker governments or minority governments and things like this, but they're fairly rare. So in most cases, with some notable exceptions, such as in Denmark, you actually have governments that are majority coalition-supported governments. In the aggregate, what are the patterns in terms of government formations? Well, about 1/3 or so of all European governments have been formed by minimal winning one-party coalitions, which is really not a coalition, between 1945 and 2010. So that's just one party having a majority in parliament and electing the executive. And this is really the UK plus Spain. The remaining cases, the other 2/3, are essentially coalition governments of one form or another. The most common is a minimal winning coalition, where you have 2 parties or 3 parties, typically 2, getting together, and they have just enough parties to form a government. Some governments are minority one-party governments, so these are governments that are relying on only one party that do not have 50% of the vote, and there are ways to get elected as an executive in this scenario, or to become the executive in such a scenario. Sometimes you borrow votes, sometimes you're a caregiver government, and things like this. A minority coalition is fairly rare, only 7% of the cases, but there are also some cases in which you have extra parties. You have oversized coalitions. So remember, a minimal winning coalition is a coalition of parties where if you take one party away, you do not have a majority anymore. And in oversized coalitions, that's different. You could take a party away and you would still have a majority. Why would you do that? Well, there's a variety of reasons why you might want to do this as a government. One of them is if you have smallish coalition partners, you want to make sure that they're not overly influential, right? If you have a minimal winning coalition and one small party is a member of it, they have a lot of bargaining power because they can say, we withdraw our support for you, which would be bad news if you were to form, if you're in government. And so if you add extra parties, these smaller parties aren't nearly as powerful.